Yajnasya Devam Ratvijam.
Welcome, guys. Today we have Ola Wikander, who is a linguist in multiple. Sorry about that. In multiple language groups, and it is a great privilege to host someone who is not only a linguist, who is also an author. He's academic, has published a lot of papers and so on. And you may have seen something like this on social media and wondered, what does this mean? What are all those symbols? Does it matter what those words are in some ancient language? How does it relate to today? How do we know any of this work that they do on languages is real or is it imagined? And today we are going to get some insights on that. He's also the author of 2 books in English and many other books in Swedish. And these books are free on the internet. If you search for them, you can find them and read them. So with that said, let's get started with the discussion. Let's start with, how did you get interested in this very esoteric field, which is not the, like, you're not a finance bro, you're not a tech, the more popular things, you decide to go into this esoteric field. How did that come about?
Yeah, it was a combination of factors, but the most important one, I think, was I grew up in an academic household. Both my parents are/were. My father is alive. My mother is deceased. They were classical scholars and classical archaeologists. I'm not an archaeologist at all, but they were, and classical scholars, and that meant that the whole idea of studies of ancient culture and so on was sort of infused in the milieu in which I grew up, and in a very concrete manner. My dad said to me when I was 12 or 13 or something, "Shouldn't I teach you a bit of Latin?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, maybe you should teach me a bit of Latin." And so he did, and then we went on to Greek, and then I discovered Hebrew, and then I found a Sanskrit teacher in my when I got a little older, and one thing led to another. So I mean, there are 2 ways to deal with that. Either you rebel against it or you take it to heart, and I took it to heart.
Right. So that seems like a whole, you've covered the whole Indo-European space and the Semitic space in between, like from essentially Sweden, which is the northwest most part of the, that region, and Sanskrit, which is the southeast most part of the region, and the central, the Ugaritic and the Semitic Hebrew. So you essentially have a grasp of half of Eurasia, which is rare for linguists. I suppose linguists are they have a taste for everything, but going into this depth in all these languages, do you feel you have more like a broader vision? Like, how do you feel you're different from other linguists?
Yeah, I mean, there's a point to what you say there, because I mean, many linguists, as in many other fields today, scholarly fields, hyper specialization is the word of the day.
Right.
That's the way scholarship generally has been moving towards greater and greater specialization, and that's good, because it demands it creates rigor. But due to my specific history of education, I got into both Indo-European and Semitic. I got first into Indo-European, then I sort of left it and studied Semitics a lot. I got my education in Old Testament studies and classical Hebrew, and then I got back into Indo-European due to various research projects and things, and sort of resurrected my old interest in Indo-European. And I'm certainly not the only one who's done both. Certainly not. But it does create special areas of, you can see things that may, borrowings from between the 2 linguistic families, which is one of my main areas of study, by the way, that perhaps others wouldn't have seen, scholars who would have expected a more clean break between these 2 linguistic families. And the fact is that they did interact, and speakers of them did interact, and you can see results of that in text and borrowed words and so on.
Right. So that brings up an interesting point. There have been, significant interactions between Semitic and Indo-European. Can you give us an example and illustrate this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, there are this is a field in ongoing development, which means that there are things that most people agree on, and there are things that are more speculative. But to take very common examples, for example, there's the word which in Indo-European languages are the word which in Indo-European is reconstructed as something like kierno. The root is kier. It's the word that appears with after certain changes in Sanskrit as shringa, which means horn, and it's actually a relative of the word, a cognate of the word horn. And there you have in Semitic languages, you have the root qarn, which appears in Hebrew as qeren, and has often historically and been regarded as a borrowing, probably from Indo-European into Semitics, but some argue for the other direction, and there are others like that. I myself have argued for actual borrowings of mythological motifs carried through words. That's kind of my shtick. The idea of trying to trace borrowings of mythological stories, not just by saying, the stories are similar, but actually trying to trace them on the word level. That's basically my shtick. But you have other famous examples, like the word which in certain Indo-European languages means bull or steer, like in Greek you have tavros,
Yes.
and then you have, let's say, in Arabic, thaur, which means basically the same thing, and that's probably a borrowing going on. And there are, you can find these, and I find that fascinating.
So the region, the region around Anatolia to Iran, between that, this was this arena for interaction between different language groups, right?
Yeah,
Semitic, and do you think languages like the Anatolian branches of Indo-European, do you think they got severely influenced because they were kind of surrounded in the sea of Semitic?
Severely sounds a little rough, but
Yeah.
but there certainly is interaction going on. But I mean, the Anatolian Indo-European language. That's my cat, by the way. Anatolian Indo-European. That's languages like Hittite and Luvian and Palaic and Lycian, which are wonderful, by the way. Those languages did get influences from many non-Indo-European sources. You have some Semitic influence, but you also have borrowings from Hurrian, which is the language of the main language of the Mitanni Kingdom, I should say, not the only one, but the main language of the Mitanni Kingdom, and also lots of influences from Hattic, which was the so to speak Aboriginal language of Anatolia that we know of. Which subsequently died out. But the Hittites, for example, borrowed lots of words from the Hattians in the sphere of traditional religion and so on. So that it certainly was as you say, a theater of interaction between various linguistic families, and that to me is very, very fascinating.
Right. So when we talk about Indo-European, most of the people focus on Greek and Sanskrit, which is understandable because that's where all the literature is.
Yeah.
But you are one of the few who has also gone into the Anatolian family, right? And you actually do teach that in some university. Is that right?
No, I've actually never taught Anatolian linguistics.
Okay.
I've taught, various Semitic languages. I've taught Hebrew, Ugaritic, and Akkadian. I never literally taught Anatolian languages, but I worked on them quite a bit.
Right.
Because if you're gonna, my main specialization is, if we're going to talk about specializations, is Ugaritic, which was a Semitic language spoken in Bronze Age Syria, on the coast of Bronze Age Syria, and that was on the crossroads between the Semitic-speaking Levant. And to the north, you had the Hittites, who were Indo-European speaking, and you had influence from the Mitannians, who, as some of your listeners may know, had at least some loan words from an Indo-Aryan language, and that created a sort of wonderful, perfect storm for these interactions. So, and if you want to study those, say Indo-European influences and borrowings in Ugaritic, you have to look at the Anatolian languages, because those are some of the most important Indo-European languages that were in a position to influence them, because they were spoken just up, northern Syria and what is today Turkey.
So these languages are no longer spoken. Many of these in that area are no longer spoken. We just have the inscriptions and and so on. So when you read them, how do you know how they are pronounced? How much of it is a guess? How much of it is
Yeah, that's a good question. I often get this question when I do interviews, and that's because it's a good question. It's a really good question. The answer is that it depends on the language. For some languages of the ancient Near East, for example, or for that matter, India, we have an unbroken tradition of recitation. Sanskrit is a good example of that, where you have several, in fact, and Hebrew is another. And that doesn't mean you can always take those at face value, but because things do change over time, but they give you something to start with. And so that's a good thing if you have that. But then you have to compare with ancient sources, which could be, for example, ancient descriptions of pronunciation, which you have for some languages, but not all. Sanskrit is a good example where we do have it. We do have it partly for some, for languages like Greek, we have, or Latin, we have lots of ancient descriptions, less so for, say, Ugaritic. But on the other hand, what we do have there is transliterations into other languages. So you can see how other languages of the region rendered certain sounds from the target language. So you can see, like this letter in that language, if you see a borrowing from a word containing that language, how is that sound rendered in the other language? And you have to sort of lay a jigsaw puzzle trying to get at how the pronunciations may have interacted. And then there's the third thing, of course, which if you do historical linguistics, which can be either, well, it could be for any linguistic family, then you have an idea of which sounds were generally around at that time in the linguistic family. That's not a source of knowledge, because sounds can change quickly. You can have a sound which corresponds exactly to a related sound in a related language, but the pronunciation may have changed. So what you do is you add all these sources of knowledge together as well as you can for the language you're looking at, and you try to reconstruct a pronunciation that is probable. And what happens is, in some cases, we know very well how language would have sounded in, say, 1000 BCE, and in others, it's more of a guess. And that's the way it has to go. Like I myself have done lots of work on, like, say, Ugaritic and early Hebrew, how certain consonants would have sounded at in certain periods of time. And that's exactly how we work. And we try to lay this big jigsaw puzzle to get at a working pronunciation. And then you can also start arguing, how did the pronunciation change over time, and look at that, which it makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, so Ugaritic and Hebrew, even though they're Semitic, both are Semitic, are they different? Like, if someone who doesn't speak either listens to both, can they distinguish that they're different languages?
Yeah. Oh yeah. They really can. And the reason for that is that Ugaritic is considerably more archaic. Ugaritic was written down in, say, the 1200s and possibly 1300s BCE, whereas the Hebrew writings are almost all of them later, quite a bit later than that, which means that more development has been going on in the phonological system in Hebrew, which means that they sound quite a bit different. Many people today, when you read reconstructed Ugaritic, people think it sounds a bit like Arabic. And
right.
that's not because it's specifically close to Arabic. It's actually much closer to Hebrew. But the reason is just that the vowel system is more archaic, which means that it reminds people of Arabic. But one shouldn't be fooled by that. It's that's a actually very important point. In historical linguistics, we distinguish between shared retentions and common innovations. Shared retentions, that's something that's a feature of a language. It could be a vowel or a word or a verbal form or whatever that has been kept on down through the ages from a parent language. It hasn't changed that much. So and if you see two languages that still have this thing in common, that they haven't changed, then it's a shared retention. But on the other hand, you have things that a new feature, a new vowel, say, or a new verbal form that is created, that then subsequent descendant languages inherit, then you say it's a shared innovation. So the fact that, say, Ugaritic vowels sound a lot like Arabic, that is not a shared innovation with Arabic. It's a shared retention. So it only means that it's both of these retained them from Proto-Semitic. That's a little technical, but it's actually an important point.
No, that's very interesting. So one of the things that I've always wondered about, and people have asked me, is the many common patterns in Sanskrit and Greek, and you are probably the best person to answer this question. The reduplicated perfect, the meters, all of these are, they're very close in Greek and Sanskrit.
Yes, they are.
Does that mean they had a common ancestor that was closer than the ancestors of other IE languages?
Yeah, that is that is the question. I mean, there have been scholars arguing for exactly that. That some people call it late Indo-European, which is a pretty weird expression because late. But the idea that that Indo-Iranian languages and Greek, like you say, do have certain things in common, like the aorist, the huge aorist system, the sigmatic aorist, the reduplicated perfect, that does appear in other. I mean, even early Germanic has reduplicated perfect. So that's probably a shared retention, not a common innovation. But there have been scholars who've argued for shared innovations between Indo-Aryan and Greek. I'm not 100% convinced, but I'm not going to say it's wrong either. That's for specialists in Greek and Indo-Iranian to decide on. But it has certainly been suggested, and it's really cool. You can see, like the aorist thing. Aorist, for those who don't know, is an early Indo-European tense form which was used originally for perfectives. That is, completed single actions, mostly in past time. You have in Sanskrit stuff like abhut and abharshit, and he was, or he she was, or he she carried, and often it's formed with an S sound. Not always, but often it's formed with some sort of an S sound, and that you find this in Greek, and you find it in Indo-Aryan and Indo-Iranian generally, and many of the early languages. But you do not find this system in, say, the Anatolian languages or in Tocharian. But in Anatolian and Tocharian, what you do find is certain specific past tense forms that have an S there. Not the whole paradigm, but just one form here and there that has an S. And a rather common idea is that Anatolian and Tocharian split at a time when the whole aorist thing wasn't actually it wasn't done yet, and that it wasn't all in existence at the point of the split, and that the latest common ancestor, shall we say, of Indo-Iranian and Greek was at a time when these specific S forms just bloomed into a whole system. And that's pretty cool to be able to do those sort of cladistic things. I like that. I really like it.
Right. So so one of the things that I've been trying to do is to look at all these languages and see if they can be put in a tree,
right,
in a way that doesn't have all of these conflicting. So, for example, there are so many common features in Indo-Iranian and every other language group, like the aorist here, the Ruki, and so on. So it is just not possible to create a tree mathematically is a set where there are subsets that are completely non-overlapping. Okay. And when they have overlaps, especially at multiple levels down, that means it's no longer a tree anymore, right? Like topologically, it's not a tree.
Yeah. You mean there are? Yeah. Okay, I get your point. Yeah.
So that brings us to the way these have been explained as, like an aerial feature or, things of that nature. I'm wondering, is it simply because the wave model is just more correct than the tree model?
No, I don't think it is. I honestly don't think so. I mean, today most historical linguists would accept that the wave thing does happen. I mean, you do see wavy stuff, but I'd say the tree is prior. The tree is ontologically prior to the wave, so to speak. But these things can get problematic. Indo-European is actually a pretty. I mean, the whole idea of building the nice tree and common innovations, shared retentions, all all of that grew to a large extent, not only, but to a large extent in the study of Indo-European, because Indo-European was one of the earliest linguistic families to be subjected to historical linguistic research, because it was born partly in the study of Indo-European. But if you look at, which means that it's often very neat, and that has to do with the way that the Indo-European language kind of just they separated, and they all went their own merry way. But if you look at stuff like Northwest Semitic, on the other hand, which is what I'm mostly working on, that's Ugaritic, Hebrew, Aramaic. There you have a situation where the different Northwest Semitic languages, they were spoken in such a tiny area in the ancient world. Northwest Semitic, that was spoken in what is today Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. It's not a super huge area, which meant that these speaker groups, even though they did diverge, and you can follow certain sound changes and so on, they still were in contact with each other. They kept in contact, whereas, say, speakers of Proto-Celtic and speakers of of what became Sanskrit were separated by lots of space. There was a lot of space between them. But the speakers of the various Northwest Semitic languages, Northwest Semitic is a subgroup of Semitic, but still, they were in close connection with each other, which meant that they seem to have continued to borrow back and forth even when while the splitting was going on, which really muddies the waters, and it creates situations that an historical linguist doesn't like, because we like neat separations, we like trees, that's what we're trained to do. Whereas whereas the Northwest Semitic languages, and actually the Semitic languages generally, were spoken in a tighter area, which meant that the interconnectedness was probably greater there. And that's why you see weird things, like sometimes, I could give you an example of this. There's a word I love, by the way, the word for serpent or snake, and I do stuff on serpent mythology, that's why I love it. You can find this word in Ugaritic. It's Bathanu, and you find the same word in Akkadian, in Mesopotamia, as Bashmu. This word doesn't really appear in its usual form often in Hebrew, because what you get in Hebrew is a word pethen, which is weird, because normally a th in Ugaritic should, if you follow the sound laws, it should appear as an esh in Hebrew, but it doesn't. It appears as a th. Which means that there's probably been some borrowing between the dialects going on, whereas the actual sound law correct word is probably Bashan in Hebrew, which normally is a term for an area. It's normally a term for a geographical area, but in certain cases, like in Psalm 68, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, I think you can see, I and others think you can probably see the old meaning serpent. So there it muddies the waters, that people have kept on borrowing words while also inheriting them. This is something that happens in other linguistic families as well, but the closer the languages are geographically, where the divergence gets less neat, which is both frustrating and exhilarating at the same time.
Right. No, and it also makes sense that people who are closer do communicate, and their languages are influenced. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. It is. Yeah, which brings us to this question of language acquisition and change. So, my daughter doesn't speak my native language, although we speak that to her. She speaks only English, because so language is not inherited, it is acquired. I mean, I think it's a well accepted fact. How does this happen, that even though we speak to her in her language, she can understand, but she doesn't speak it? What is the thing behind it?
Yeah, the thing behind it, I would guess, I don't want to make a judgment on the situation in your family, obviously, but the fact that you live in an English-speaking majority culture, which is suffused with English, which means that I would guess to her or any other person in that situation, the inherited language, and I do say inherited within quotes, becomes the language you heard mum and dad speak. It's not the language you speak in other contexts. And if your mum and dad also speak the majority language, as you do, then it's quite easy to just stick to that, because that's the language your friends speak, and that's the language you speak to the authorities. If the language one has, quote unquote, inherited is a language that is really, really a minority language, this is a dangerous situation. That's what we call domain loss. When the language you have, so to speak, inherited is one that is only used at home, or perhaps only with your grandmother, and you stop being able to talk about, say, universities, education, or finances in that language, then the language gets shrunk to it loses domains of use. And when that happens, it's on the verge of extinction. This is not the case in your case, obviously. But if it were a very small language that with, say, 1,000 speakers, this is a serious danger. So yeah, it's sociological reasons. That's what it is.
Well, so if I were to model this mathematically, I would model it as a network effect. What that means is my daughter has 2 data points, or 2 edges in the network to speak this language, and she has like 2,000 other edges to speak.
Exactly. Yes.
So she has her friends, she has her teachers, she has all this media that they now consume, which is like media, social media and mass media is really like 1,000 people that maybe you don't talk back to them, but they talk to you. And what happens is there is a mathematical event or a process where the bigger a network effect, the more quicker it grinds the smaller network effect, right? So we see that with social media itself, when Facebook essentially ended up grinding out MySpace, Orkut, and a bunch of others.
Yes.
Even though they were big, eventually, like whatever dominates will over time grind everything out to nothing. So it doesn't mean new networks cannot come up. It's just it has to have characteristics that give such an advantage that it can grind out the others. Based on the network effect, I think we can create a model that represents the language families.
Right.
And
well, I'm not a mathematician, so
I'm just mentioning it for the users.
Okay.
So language is so that is what a lot of people they're surprised that the kids don't pick up their language, because the reason is they are marinated in a different place, right? That makes sense. Yes. But you, as not just as a teen but as an adult, you learned more languages as well.
Yeah, I did. I went on. I started like I said in my adolescence with certain ancient languages, and then when I got to university, it the snowball kept rolling, and that's something that I've at first, to me, this to me was all a hobby when I was younger, and then what happened was I got into Old Testament studies actually a bit by the pretzel way, if you will, because what happened was I'd started studying Akkadian and Ugaritic by myself, and I met the then professor of Old Testament studies in Lund, Trygve Mettinger, who died 2 years ago, who was giving a course in Akkadian, and I sort of shoved myself into that course, even though I was much too young to partake, actually. But he accepted me, grudgingly at first. But then it turned out that I fit in very well, and that got me into Old Testament studies, because I noticed that was where they would do. He was doing Ugaritic, for example, which was something I had a love for, and and then it went on from there. And like I said, I met my Sanskrit teacher also at university, because also actually through the religious studies department, because he came at it from a religious studies, a Indian Indology, Indian religions background, and so I got into that much more than I had earlier, and then again the snowball kept rolling, and it still does, actually. I'm trying to get better at Tocharian right now.
How many languages would you say that you are familiar with?
Oh wow! It all depends on how you count.
Throw a number. Just
I'd say between 15 and 20.
That's pretty good. Yeah, that's a lot of languages. And do you feel it gets easier with every new language, or does it get harder with every new language?
It does get easier generally because you have the sort of linguistic setup in your head to process linguistic data and to process grammatical systems quickly, because you learn a sort of framework for putting stuff in the correct place in your head. So in that sense, it does get easier, and also when the languages are related, like Semitic languages or Indo-European languages, you know parts of what you're going to expect, and that certainly helps. On the other hand, you get older, which means that your aptitude for assimilating large amounts of vocabulary gets lower. And I could notice that this started changing around the age of 20. That's when it starts going downhill. Because when you're before 20 years old, you're like a sponge.
Yes.
You can just it just sticks. I remember this. You could just I could just like look at a list of a vocabulary list once, and it stuck. And that's not really the way it works anymore. Now I really have to repeat it, and so I'd say that generally it does get easier on a linguistic level, but on a human level it can get harder due to aging.
And I think this is why in Indian systems you start learning language at age 7. And by the time you are 15 or 16, you're done basically.
And like it in the the diasporic Jewish communities, in the traditional religious curriculum there, in say in Eastern Europe, you often started, at least if you were a man, because it was
male only.
You started learning Hebrew at 3.
That's the right age, I think, actually. That's a good so for me at least, or at least a lot of people in their languages, they're not able to distinguish certain phonemes like L and R in Asian languages, V and W in Indians, and so on. And I think that's due to neurocircuitry. Have you had this problem distinguishing phonemes when you learn a new language?
That's a good question. I've tried to avoid it, obviously. I mean, there are, to be brutally honest, there are two attitudes among learners of ancient languages. And one of them is that it doesn't really matter how we pronounce it, because the language is dead anyway, and we're not going to get a totally accurate pronunciation. So let's just superimpose our own phonology on the text, and it doesn't
make a difference.
Doesn't make any difference. Like, there are many Western Sanskritists who are awesome at Sanskrit, but still doesn't distinguish the and the in when they read it, because I think you should make the effort. I personally think you should make the effort, because and that's something I try to teach my students as well. That most of my students I teach Hebrew to, and I try to use a reconstructed pronunciation, and I encourage them to do the same. I don't force them to, but I encourage them to, saying that if you can actually hear something that's a little closer to how it would have sounded in, say, Judah in the 500s, well, probably actually 600s BCE, or for that matter 300 BCE or whatever, then you could get a closer, wordplay, for example, because, say, Hebrew Bible texts often have a lot of wordplay in it. So do Sanskrit texts. And it's much easier to notice this stuff when you actually do pronounce the sounds more or less correctly. So, but if you want to do that, coming back to your original question, you really have to think phonologically. You cannot use the sound in your language that is most similar. You have to start with a mechanical phonological programming. Like you have to, if you come from a language that doesn't have retroflexes, you have to physically learn to say g and d. You have to learn. There I'm a bit. It was easy for me because Central Swedish has retroflexes, but most European languages don't. And in the same way, if you're learning many Semitic languages have pharyngeal, so you have to learn to say and that can take a long time, because it's the pharynx is a part of the phonological apparatus that many languages in Europe don't use. So you have to go at it mechanically and try to enunciate the sounds by actually really internalizing the descriptions of which part of the tongue, which phonation, and it's hard for some people. Like Swedes, for example, often have also a very hard time distinguishing W and V when they speak English. Many Swedes do,
They use V most of it. Yeah.
which leads to hypercorrection, which leads to
Right.
stuff like very good and Darth Vader, because some Swedes hypercorrect
Right.
and think that all V's in English should be W's. But you have to learn that this is a sound that Swedish doesn't have, and it's just as valid, even though Swedish doesn't have it, you know?
Right. Which brings us to the question: when a word is borrowed,
Yeah.
if that sound doesn't exist in the the target language, is it fair to expect that the speakers will change the word rather than absorb the sound, which is more likely?
Yeah. In most cases, not all, but most cases, what happens is that you have what you call a substitution rule, which is not the same thing as a sound law. A sound law is, a description of how a certain language has changed a sound over time.
Right.
A substitution rule is something saying that if a word is borrowed from this language to that language, and the language in which the word originated, the giver, so to speak, the lone giver, has a sound that the borrower doesn't have, then usually sound X is sound Y is substituted for sound X in the language, and usually that happens with a rather large amount of regularity, not 100% though, and you can see this changing, for example, in say again Swedish, at a time when English was less prevalent as a second language in Sweden, people were I think more inclined to borrow W's as V's into Swedish, whereas now they're borrowed with W's because that sound has been sort of internalized. So that can change, but usually they are substituted for a native sound. But sometimes, like the Swedish work case, you actually do, after a while, borrow in the entire sound. There's a very, very cool example of this in one verse in the book of Daniel. One verse that has a specific type of P, which only occurs in that one word, which is probably due to the word being borrowed from Persian. And they try to sort of use that specific phoneme to express what the Persian would have sounded like. So sometimes borrowings do try to borrow sounds as well. But the most common thing is that you just substitute a native sound for it.
So in the Indian context, there was Persian was the administrative language during the Muslim rule.
Yeah.
And it's a funny thing. The Persian was actually brought in by the Turks who had adopted, had Persianized themselves. And the word with the Z, like zindagi, zinda. So the cool thing about it is a section of the population substituted it with J. So they would say jindagi.
Yeah.
But there's another population which, in the same area, there would be others who would use the original Z. They would say, so you can have two people talking to each other.
And in Hindi Urdu, they had the difference with speakers who have q and speakers who don't, all that stuff. Yeah, all that stuff.
And somehow people understand each other. And they and so how important is, having every phoneme accurate to the understanding of speech?
Now, that's an interesting question. I mean, if you can map if somebody else speaks a dialect or a register that doesn't have all the phonemes you have, if you can map them one-to-one in a pretty easy way onto the phonemes you have, you will probably understand it. But there will, of course, be cases where there will be misunderstandings, because sometimes person A has two phonemes in but person B only has one, and there may be a minimal pair that is destroyed so that two words sound the same. But then, of course, you can be helped by the context. The context always helps with this. Always. So, I mean, modern Hebrew is a good example of this. Classical Hebrew had lots of sounds that have fallen together in modern Hebrew. Like most modern Hebrew speakers no longer have the ah, for example. A minority does, but most of them don't. And the difference between te and the isn't realized by speakers of modern Hebrew, which means that some words do become the same, that weren't the same in earlier stages of the language. But then, of course, the context helps because you can guess which of the words would be relevant in a certain context, and so it all comes down to context. But the more it diverges, and the bigger the difference is. I mean, if the difference between the phonemes isn't just that one of them, I mean, if it is that one speaker has a specific added feature, like pharyngalization, like that example, the difference between t and b, you can say that, well, the tongue is still in basically the same place. It's up near the alveolar region or the dental region, so you can, yeah, it's pretty similar. But if the change of articulation is much greater, then you can really lose. It doesn't look anything like each other at all. There are extreme examples of this, which isn't in one generation at all. Like ancient Egyptian, which is a relative of Semitic. It's not a Semitic language, but it's part of the same greater Afro-Asiatic language family. And there is a modern-ish theory, which I subscribe to, that says that Egyptian has an sound as well, but that modernist theory says that sometimes comes from a d historically, which is like they moved it in that case from the extreme front of the mouth to the extreme back of the mouth. It's like there's nothing in common, but that would have happened over many generations. But sometimes sound changes can be extreme. Mostly they're not, but they can be extreme. And when they are, it's usually due to there being many steps on the way. And what we find in writing is the beginning and the end of this huge change, the huge process of change, which can be bewildering, but it's, again, exhilarating.
I think orthography also influences how the word is borrowed. Like, when...
it can, yes.
Yeah, when people borrow like French words, they say all the silent letters,
Yeah, it can happen. Yeah,
like
yeah.
New Orleans, from like Olon or whatever.
And it can create weird orthographic blends, like my own native language, Swedish, which has borrowed lots of French words in, say, the 18th century and so on. But most of them have been adapted today to Swedish spelling, which means that if a French person sees them, they would probably not recognize them because they're adapted to Swedish spelling, and they can create very, very weird blends. Like we've borrowed the suffix "ur" as in doer of something, like chauffeur or restaurateur. We've borrowed that suffix, but we spell it with an ö vowel, o with an umlaut, r. But if we say, you take for example the word chauffeur, which in Swedish is chauffeur. With a very Swedish sound, chauffeur. We spell the first syllable we spell in French, and the second syllable we spell in Swedish, because the second syllable is part of this borrowed suffix which we've nativized. So the spelling ends up as a sort of weird Swedish-French blend, which would make a Frenchman or French woman go nuts seeing it. I love stuff like this.
Do you think the widespread literacy and the printing press slows down language change because now there's this point of stabilization that people read the old books, and does that happen, or do you find language changes faster in illiterate groups?
I mean, it can go both ways, but generally I will say that, widespread literacy does sometimes slow down language change, because you have especially if you have a language norm, which is taught in schools, that this is correct and this is incorrect. If you do have that, and that doesn't have to do with, you can do that for purely with recitational languages as well. If you have a very, very strong recitation tradition, you can say this is how it should be, Right. Like you can see that, like in again in early Indian stuff, the strong distinction between Sanskritam and Prakritam, that they were regarded as being different. There was a subjective feeling that there were two variants of Old Indic. Well, there were more than two, but two main registers. Certainly a strong tradition of literacy and strong normativity in that literacy does sometimes slow things down. But then stuff happens. You can see very cool examples of this when a speaker base switches their their writing system, and you can see that stuff has been happening beneath the surface. And a very cool example of this is Coptic, that is the latest stage of ancient Egyptian. Ancient Egyptian was very, very conservative in its writing system. The classical language was standardized as Middle Egyptian, and people kept on writing Middle Egyptians for 1,000 years after people stopped speaking like that. And even the later phases of Egyptian were very conservative in some ways. And the verb, and people started, instead of using full verbal forms, they started writing things like he did the hearing. Instead of writing the equivalent of he heard, you write he did the hearing. Yerif Sujam, he did hearing, which looks as though the verbal system is sort of collapsing. But then when the Egyptian population, most of them were converted to Christianity and thereby became Copts.
Right.
They switched to using a Greek-based spelling system, a Greek-based alphabet. And then you can suddenly see how a whole new verbal system has emerged from these he did the hearing type constructions. And now they don't write it Yerif Sujam, he did the hearing. They just write one word, Afsotam, he heard. And there you can see that there had been an entirely new verbal inflection growing, but the spelling couldn't show it as such because they spelt in they used a very conservative mode of spelling in the hieroglyphic and hieratic and demotic systems. Whereas in speech, the language had moved on. And when they switched writing system, you can suddenly see what had happened. And stuff like that is really cool.
Yeah, and I think the writing systems, the recitation, the normative, systems, these are all examples of creations of network effects. And when a shift happens from one writing system to another, there is a window where a second, an alternate network effect can just take over and dominate, because there was this need for a long time that was not addressed. And this is the break that, enables that change.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is, it is very interesting how language is not just what you speak, but also what you write.
Yeah, and they interact. That's they influence each other back and forth in a weird, meshy way.
And does the language, our understanding of language and historical linguistics, does it change when we find something in archaeology? Certainly inscriptions, but non-inscription. Just give us both.
Say, you broke up a bit. Repeat your question, please.
Does our understanding of historical linguistics change when we find something in archaeology, whether it's inscriptions or otherwise?
Well, yes, obviously it can. And I mean, inscriptions is a very, very concrete way of this happening. But, it can also, of course, change if you're say mapping, as, migrations and things like that, and you find a new possible, say, archaeological culture that can be either support or change those maps, then of course it can certainly have
impact,
an influence on your reconstruction. Obviously that's the case, but I'd say inscriptions and actually written material is the most clear evidence, because otherwise you always get into the situation where you can say that we have this archaeological culture and it does fit our reconstruction of the culture on linguistic, so we infer that they would probably have spoken something like this. Then, like when you discuss Proto-Indo-Iranian and the Sintasha culture and stuff like that. But when you actually have a text, so well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're probably familiar with my work on the IndoScript and so on. So hopefully over time, so this is like a never-ending quest, right? The whole linguistics, because not only the present is changing, we are getting language changes. Like if you look at the Ebonics movement in the US, where really is a completely different dialect.
Yeah.
We are also, with our new tools, computational tools, and now all the engineers have stepped in. The past also is changing, right? People are challenging like the time duration when something happened, or they're creating new models and so on. So what's your view on all of this?
No, what's my view on all of this? My view is that I'd say this: the methodologies of comparative linguistics were, the basis of it was laid down in the 19th century, not the specifics, the basis. Right. You have to separate this. Sometimes people say, that this means that comparative linguistics is 19th century science. It doesn't mean that at all, or scholarship. The only thing it means is that some of the theoretical bases were laid then. The idea of sound laws, the idea that you can follow sounds historically and there should be ideally no or at least very, very few exceptions to sound laws, and you should be able to explain those exceptions. That has stood the test of time. So what I will say is that moving forward onto new, like you said, new technical innovations, AI stuff, computational methods and all that, you have to keep the basic methodological rigor that these Brugman and the gang developed. You have to keep, and Noldeke in Semitics, you have to keep their methodological rigor intact and combine that with the modern technologies that one develops. There have been, I'm not going to name any names, but there have been examples of people using certain modern computational methods and sort of forgetting the insights that that historical linguistics made over 100 years ago, which has led to wrong conclusions. So I think that the important thing is to keep your head on straight and not forget what you already learned.
Great. So we've been here for a long time. I don't see any questions from the audience. Do you want to give any closing remarks before we wrap it up?
Well, my closing remark will just be that studying ancient languages is wonderful. It gives an access to ancient peoples, which basically nothing else does. And studying, say, Indo-European and Semitic, these are two of the most important linguistic families in the histories of Europe and parts of Asia. And studying their interactions shows how earlier peoples met each other, how they shared their stories, how they shared their words, sometimes what they thought, and that is a very, very fun and I think necessary thing to do.
I agree with you. It's like looking into the minds of the people millennia ago, which is no device can bring it to you except by going through what they said and what they wrote. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Hopefully we will do this again. And thank you.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.